And it's time to tackle some of the best isometric exercises for building muscle and strength in the pull chain. All the muscles in the back, biceps, and the forearm muscles and gripping muscles. Once again, we're using our trusty WorldFit Iso trainer, but be creative. Use suspension straps, yoga belts, martial arts belts. Even a sturdy towel can be used for most of these exercises. And we start off with one of the most basic exercises for the pull chain, which is the isometric row. You're gonna sit on the floor, have the strap underneath your feet, but closer to your heels for support and stability, using a length that allows your elbows to be bent roughly about a 90-degree angle, but you can adjust and see what feels most comfortable for you. And we're not gonna lean back. We want to avoid using too much of the extension chain, and instead we're making like the rowing motion with our back, biceps, and grips. So rolling the shoulders back, chest is up nice and high, and applying force as if I'm trying to row my feet closer to me. Squeeze the elbows in to really get your lats engaged, biceps on, and holding tight with the forearm muscles to have a firm grip onto the handles. Very similar exercise, but a little bit different, is the high row. You're gonna have a bit of a longer strap for this, same seated position as before. This one helps to target a little bit more in the upper back, particularly in your traps, where you're gonna bring your elbows up and pull with a pronated grip. You can play around with different grips, but it's gonna feel a little bit weird and awkward. And this one always makes me think of these moves from my Taekwondo techniques. You want your hand, shoulder, and elbow roughly about the same height. We're not really high. We're not doing this sort of a thing. We're just simply pulling with the hand, elbow, and shoulders roughly the same height, putting a particular emphasis on squeezing the traps together. The isometric rear fly is another variation. Works pretty much the same muscles as the high row, but some people prefer this as just a little easier to get a lot of leverage on those upper back muscles and the rear deltoids. Probably gonna use a longer strap. Keep in mind you can also adjust the distance by bending or straightening your legs a little bit. You're gonna have your palms facing forwards. This mimics your classic rear fly. I recommend keeping your shoulders down and your elbows ever so slightly kinked. So that way you're using a lot of your back muscles and you're not putting too much strain and stress in the actual joints themselves. You can also micro adjust with the width of your feet because this is not a very strong technique. So you can have your feet apart and you're not gonna feel like you're pressing them together with so much force in your arms. Play also with the height of this. Sometimes it feels good to be nice and low. Feels like it emphasizes the traps a little more, a little higher, can get the shoulders and the upper traps. Go with where you feel it working best in the muscle. The seated biceps curl is kind of a little reminiscent of the old classic preacher curls. I used to love the preacher curl when I first started strength training. It felt like it targeted the biceps so effective. And this is very similar because you're gonna bend your knees, have a relatively short strap length, or just choke up on the towel that you're using. You're gonna place your elbows into your thighs and make like you're curling your hands up towards your chin. Play around with your placement on your legs. You may feel a little bit stronger of a contraction in one position or the other. And you're just curling, try not to hunch up too much, keep a little bit of tension in your back. So remember, your back and biceps work synergistically. So a lot of times if we feel we're not getting the tension we want in our biceps, it means our back is too relaxed. So keeping the back lightly engaged and release after the allotted amount of time. The next series of exercises are all standing, where we are stepping down onto our strap or towel. You can hold down with either one foot or both. These are not particularly strong exercises. So you don't need to have the strap underneath a platform or anything. Underneath your bare feet or shoes is perfectly fine. And we're going to first start off with our classic curl variations. Just like a standing dumbbell or barbell curl, you can adjust the length to where you want to start off with, but usually having The elbow bent roughly 90 degrees is a good place for most folks to start. And the key again, roll the shoulders back. When we're curling all hunched up, that really puts a lot more kind of a strain in the shoulders as opposed to the biceps. So shoulders back. Also make sure your glutes and your abs are contracted, because there's the tendency to start arching and getting all kinds of wonky body positions. So you want shoulders back, glutes, quads, everything's nice and upright, ramrod straight. And we're just making like a standard bicep curl. It also helps to have a little bit of a curl in the wrist. If you feel like you're curling with a bent wrist, that can feel really awkward on the wrists joint, but it's also kind of more of a forearm exercise at that point. So have a slight curve, and now we're curling like so. You play around with the position too of your hands. Some people like it in, some people like out. That can feel very good because it's getting a little bit more engagement in your back. Go with where you feel the muscles working the hardest. One of my favorites is the drag curl. And I like the drag curl because it helps us maintain that force integrity, if you will, of applying force throughout the entire body. When we are holding the curl way out in front of us, that puts a lot of force in front of the body. But a drag curl means that we're keeping the hands really close in towards our center line. And shoulders are back, elbows may even be behind you. And this is technically or mechanically a weaker technique. So if you ever do this with weight, you're gonna find you're not gonna be able to lift nearly as much as you would with like a standard curl. But in my mind, that's a great thing because it makes it easier to work the muscle really, really hard. So same sort of setup, keeping the body nice and straight, hands really close in. And I feel when I do this, like you're pulling yourself straight up your body, like zipping up a zipper. So this is a drag curl, as they call it. And also don't forget you can play around with a overhand curl if you are so inclined. That can be a fun variation. And for some reason that works really well with drag curls as opposed to the other curl. Really hits that brachyradialis for also a little bit more forearm work as well. Classic upright rows. This is a really good one to hit isometrically because the upright row with the old school bodybuilder, you see Arnold doing this pumping iron kind of thing. This is one of those techniques that has fallen largely out of favor because it can be a little risky on the shoulders if you're not using proper technique. And rightfully so, a lot of coaches have said, let's just get rid of this overall and not recommend it. But when you're doing it isometrically, you can have a lot more control over your technique and the tension flowing throughout your body, which makes it a lot safer. This, of course, is a little bit more in the shoulders and the traps. Some people consider this more of a shoulder exercise, sometimes more of a bicep exercise or a back exercise. Really, it falls wherever you want to place it. But for this, I like to have a crossover with my handles because when we're doing this, there's a bend in the wrist. So if I can angle the handles a little bit, that's a lot more ergonomic on my hands versus trying to do this sort of thing. So having that cross feels really good. And I'm not coming way up with this. I use the same principle as I did with the high row, where hand, elbow, and shoulder are roughly the same height. Just keeps things on a nice even keel. And I'm driving my elbows and my hands up equally with my shoulders and my traps. You may want to try a little bit of scapular elevation with this one if you want to emphasize the upper traps, and keep your hands relatively close in as well. You don't want it like way out in front of you. So really tight in as if you're doing this in front of a wall, and gently release, kind of roll it out a few times just to loosen things up when you're done. Isometrics are also particularly good for waking up and strengthening those sleepy lats on the backside, because lots of times people who are struggling with things like pull-ups, deadlifts, bent over rows, it's because their lats have poor activation. There's two exercises I want to show you for this. The first one is a classic lat pull down. You'll see sometimes people doing this on cable machines where they're pulling down or with bands. Same thing isometric. We've got our strap looped up over something that's a sturdy anchor point. Our arms are straight, shoulders are packed, down and back, and I'm essentially just driving downwards with my lats. Other associated muscles are your traps, your rear deltoids, even your triceps a little bit, but you want to feel like your triceps are the lats are your main ones. You may even feel this a little bit in your abs. It's a good abdominal exercise. Use different widths, maybe that makes a difference. Sometimes coming back at an angle or using a different height can make a difference. You're looking for where you can feel it the most in your lats. Don't want to just assume that the muscles are doing what they should be doing just because they're supposed to be doing any sort of engagement. You want to feel the muscle working to know that it's getting the job done. And if you don't have an overhead support, you can always do a bent over or hinged lat activation. So we're just going to stand on the strap, have the handles roughly about hip height, maybe a little bit further. You can micro adjust with your foot width, having the strap underneath the arches close to the heel, and I'm driving backwards with my lats, keeping your back straight and your shoulders packed. It's also very effective to feel like you're squeezing in, almost like I'm trying to touch my hands behind me. It's a weaker mechanically exercise than the one where you're hanging, but it can be a very effective way to wake up and strengthen sleepy lat muscles. It is also a very effective warm-up before any sort of dynamic back work like pull-ups, rows, or deadlifts. Now, when it comes to vertical pulling, you have several options, but that can be a little bit harder to set up because it does have a bit more of an equipment requirement. The first of which is your isometric kind of a lat pull down. And for this, you want to use a classic lat pull down machine, but you want something where you can throw the strap or a towel over the top of it. Not all of the machines out there can accommodate this because they've got like angled top supports and stuff, but this one here that I'm using has a nice flat support, and I'm using my handles roughly about chest height. The support is keeping me down, preventing it from being a pull-up, and I'm basically doing like a lat pull-down isometrically, keeping my shoulders back, really good for hitting the lats in a very effective way, and the biceps as well. You can also play around with isometric pull-ups, where you may be able to anchor a strap or something really heavy, so that way you're not pulling yourself all the way up like a weighted pull-up. But in this case, I'm using my iso trainer and able to kind of attach it to the foot plates on this pull-up machine. You can even use a strap on a pull-up unit or a pull-up bar. You can get a little creative with this, but I'm just hooking my feet underneath it, so that's preventing me from coming up. Very, very effective to put a lot of tension into your pull chain muscles for pull-up and pull-down exercise variations. And finally, we can't cover pull chain without talking satisfying grip and forearm work. For this one, you may want to use a platform because we might be putting a lot of force into the strap, but for some variations, it won't be too much of force into the muscles, tension in the muscles, so you can probably get away with it. And if you're using any sort of devices that have an inherent grip challenge, like a towel or a martial arts belt, oh, you're more than covered anyway. But you're gonna have your handles roughly about thigh height, and you want it to be at a distance where I'm hooking on with just the finger bellies of my hands. So then when I roll my hand underneath, like I'm flexing my wrist, that gives me a very satisfying contraction in my forearm flexors. Make sure you're even. And I'm essentially pulling down. You can add a little bit more by shrugging up with your shoulders, your upper back. And I'm working my forearm flexors very hard, holding with a bit of a hook grip, pulling upwards. And you can also kind of micro adjust with your legs as well. Very effective for those forearms. Make sure you have even pressure on all four of your fingers. You don't want it all in just your biggest two fingers near your thumb. You can also play around with your variations here in front of you. You may feel like one is just a little more ergonomic, or even something behind. I know some people, they like that old classic behind the back barbell wrist curl. You can simulate the same thing by just holding the handle slightly behind you. Lots of variations, lots of satisfying ways to get a good forearm pump. And for the extensor, we're probably going to want a little bit of a longer strap. And same basic idea, only now instead of curling with wrist flexion, we have wrist extension for this. And I've got a little bit of pressure on the fingertips as I'm pulling upwards. You may want to feel like you're pulling or rising up with a forward front raise just to give a little bit more emphasis. Granted, this is a weaker mechanical technique, so you're not going to need nearly as much force with it, but it will give you a very satisfying amount of tension right over the top of the forearm. Play around with different hand positions, see what feels best for you. You're looking for stability. You're looking for where do you feel comfortable with the technique, so that way you can put as much effort and emphasis into the muscles that you're working and not necessarily holding your body in the correct position or in space. As always, there are loads of variations of all of these exercises. Play around, be creative with it. Check out this video here for more information on programming overcoming isometrics for various goals like strength or building muscle. And here's the review that I made on the World Fit Iso Trainer if you want to learn more about that. And links to those resources are down below in the description as well. Best of luck with your training. Stay strong, be fit, and live free.